We all know that Lincoln freed the slaves, but it's interesting to go through the process by which he did that. When Lincoln was running for president, he told everybody that he would not eliminate slavery. And when he became president and the South walked out of the Union, his real fear was that the border states that were slave states would secede with the South. He was worried about Missouri and Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware, all slave states. And if Maryland walked out, Washington, D.C. would be surrounded by Confederate territories. So Lincoln stayed far away from the issue of slavery. When Fremont, who was the Republican nominee for president in 1856, became the military governor of Missouri after it was conquered by the Union, Fremont announced he was going to eliminate slavery. And Lincoln fired Fremont and revoked the order because he didn't want to alienate Kentucky and the other states. But then, as the Civil War dragged on through 1862, two things became clear. The first was that Britain was moving very close, along with France, to recognizing the Confederacy. Britain had by far the best navy in the world, and they could have broken the Union blockade of the South, which was really the major weapon the North had in the war. Because the blockade was hurting Britain as much as it was hurting the South. Because Britain's entire textile industry, which employed 10% of their labor force, was dependent on cotton shipments from the South. And with the Union blockade, they couldn't get through. Now, the British had abolished slavery very early in the 19th century, and they were strongly anti-slavery in public opinion. So Lincoln realized that if he banned slavery and made that one of his war aims, the British public would never permit the government to intervene on the side of the South. The second problem Lincoln had was that the war was going very badly, huge numbers of casualties, and enlistments were drying up. He was having trouble filling the ranks of the Union Army, and in fact he announced that he was going to have to go to a draft system to fill them up. And meanwhile, in the South, the Confederate forces were using slaves to dig their trenches and to set up their embattlements and all of that stuff, and be at their arms factories, and that was a problem for Lincoln. So in July of 1862, Lincoln announced to his cabinet that he was going to issue an Emancipation Proclamation, freeing the slaves. But he wanted to wait for a victory to be able to do it, so it wasn't seen as something that was desperate. And at the Battle of Antietam, that was really not a victory, it was a draw, but the North remained in possession of the field as Lee retreated back into Virginia. Antietam's in Maryland. That gave Lincoln the excuse he needed. So he announced around September of 1862 that on January 1st, 1863, he would issue a proclamation freeing all of the slaves that were currently in areas controlled by the Confederacy. The areas controlled by the Union, they would not be freed because he didn't want to alienate those states. So some said he's just freed every slave he doesn't have the power to free. And Lincoln said back, the reason I did it this way is because the Constitution doesn't allow me to free the slaves. But as a war power, I can do it. And if I'm only freeing the slaves in those states now in rebellion against the United States, then it's a war power and it's legal for me to do it. Anyway, he did it. And very shortly thereafter, there came the decision to enlist former slaves and free blacks in the Union Army. And everywhere the Union Army advanced, slaves ran to cross the Union lines to be free, and then many of them joined the Union Army. By the end of the war, about 1/5 of the total Union Army was black, and they had fought usually always in segregated regiments, but with great bravery and great distinction. The South, by the way, in about a month before Appomattox, said that they too would now enlist black soldiers and promised them freedom after the South won the war, but there weren't many takers. So the freed blacks played a huge role in this whole process of winning the Civil War. Then, after the war was over, the Congress passed the 13th Amendment that amended the Constitution, banning slavery in the entire country, which they were able to do because it was a constitutional amendment.